What's going on, everybody? This is Reese and Loretta coming at you from Ornery Mule Racing. We're here with the Dirt podcast. We're going to be talking with y'all about tempo and threshold runs today. So grab a coffee, grab a beverage of choice, join in with us. Loretta, how you doing today?
I am doing great. I've actually got in my first run of the day. Today's my recovery day, so I typically break that into two runs.
Awesome. So you just got done with run number one of two. Are you going to
Yes,
do the other one in the afternoon?
yes, I am.
Awesome. Sweet. Yeah, I just got done with my run this morning too. I got a little bit of time before I go into the clinic, and I'm super excited to talk about different running intensities. So let's jump right into it. I guess I'll define what we're talking about when we say threshold and tempo intensities.
Okay,
So
sounds good.
a threshold pace is going to be a pace, an effort at which your body is developing lactate faster than it can clear it. Everybody has this type of threshold. Your body is producing lactate at all points during the day, whether you're just sitting down or whether you're out for an easy jog or a really hard run. And when we're running intensely enough, there's a certain point where our body can no longer accumulate or can no longer process that metabolic byproduct. So it accumulates in the bloodstream, and give it enough time or a hard enough intensity, that's what we feel as that burning of the muscles. That's what we feel as that kind of metallic taste in the mouth. Um, and that's really where our dividing line is between like aerobic and heavy anaerobic type of running. So it's a pretty important boundary. Tempo running, on the other hand, is going to be just below that boundary. So your body's going to be able to clear out all of the lactate that it's producing, but you are producing a high amount, enough to at least challenge your body's capability to clear it in a timely manner. So that way you can keep running quick without getting too fatigued. And this type of intensity, this tempo intensity, even the threshold intensity, are going to be the driving factors for our endurance. This is the intensity at which how hard can you go and how fast can you keep moving. It's oftentimes discussed as one of the more important metrics as to somebody's success is how fast can they go before their body starts becoming too anaerobic and this lactate and metabolic byproduct accumulate too fast. So, Loretta, with those two definitions, what do you think about tempo and threshold running?
Well, we were talking a little bit, and I do feel like those terms are used quite interchangeably, tempo and the threshold piece. So I do also value both of those types of running. I think that knowing and just kind of walking that line of that threshold line, just at or just below it is going to give you probably the most bang for your buck, if you want to say. It's a really powerful tool in increasing that threshold to build your intensity for longer periods of time. And I think it's also hard, right? Isn't it? I mean, I think when I have a tempo workout, or a threshold workout in my schedule, it's hard. It's not an easy thing to do. You're in a comfortably hard state where you're having to focus a little bit more on what you're doing rather than just going out there and moving your legs. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this can kind of call back on a previous podcast that we did about feeling these sensations in our body. So if we really pay attention to what our body is feeling when we're in that tempo area, which again is just below your lactate threshold, which is going to be a slightly easier pace than a threshold run, and slightly meaning pretty slightly. So it's going to be hard. It's going to be fast. It's going to be something that you can sustain for an hour 15, hour 20 minutes. So it might not feel too intense when you first start. But the interesting thing about these tempos is that the accumulation of time at that higher intensity is going to be the determining factor of how the workout feels at the very end. So a lot of these runs, like I build up my athletes doing, just like about 20 to 30 minutes of tempo running broken up in a couple different intervals. And then we'll transition and we'll start making those intervals a little bit longer. Maybe we'll decrease the rest a little bit just to keep challenging the body's ability to process and clear that lactate. Because again, that is a huge driver and a huge stimulus for the body when you accumulate 30 to 40 to 50 minutes at the high end of work at something that you can really sustain for about like an hour to an hour 15 minutes.
Right.
So
Yeah. And I like to kind of blend. I mean, I do like to have days that are just for tempo type running, but I also like to build it into a long run. So doing, let's say, a cut down or progression run to get in that tempo piece, as you're later into the long run, when your legs might be and your body might be and your mind might be a little fatigued, then throw in that little bit different I I'm trying to think of a word that I want to use, a little bit different stimulus, to work on to make you stronger mentally and physically.
yeah, that's absolutely huge. And I guess, just to clarify something that I just brought up, one can use a proxy of about like an hour or an hour, 15-minute race as about their lactate threshold, their threshold pace. So say if you run a half marathon in about like an hour and 20 minutes, you can take that pace per mile. I think it's like 6:12, 6:13 or something. You can take that pace per mile and say, okay, maybe my tempo range is about 6:12 to 6:20. So it's like right there, if not just like a little bit lower. So when we're talking that a tempo pace should be about like an hour 15-minute pace, some people are finishing their 10Ks in an hour
Right.
15 minutes. So therefore, you would use your 10K as kind of your proxy pace.
Yeah,
Um,
I like that. I like how that you said that because I think it makes it a little easier for people to understand when they're looking at where are they at right now and how do I figure out what
yeah.
my pace should be. So I think that's a good description.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just to kind of build off of what you said too, like as a progression for how to build in these tempos for our athletes, like I really like to spend a couple weeks where we're kind of building up, like we said before, like a total of 20, a total of 30, a total of 40 minutes. And then once athletes can do that on their own, then we can start to incorporate it into some of the fun stuff that's a little bit closer towards somebody's goal event. Because when we go out, say, if we do a 20-mile long run and we have it be a progression downwards. So as the time goes on, the fatigue sets in, the muscles don't want to react the way that they do come 17, 18, 19 miles as opposed to the first, second, or third one. So if we can then call upon our muscles to say, hey, you know what, we've been running way below our threshold, something that's very sustainable for a long time. We're going to accumulate a lot of pounding on the ground. We're going to accumulate a lot of muscular stress and some damage for sure, some metabolic stress. Come the last portion now, if we can spend 4 or 5 weeks building somebody up to a good tempo pace and they can sustain that for a while, now let's add that on to the end of a long run. Maybe we do 2 or 3 miles at the very end at your tempo pace. Now that's with the caveat that everything that came before it was way below, was comfortably easy. Just because the workout really starts at like mile 15, 16 with these types of progression runs, because we want to build up the body to accumulate all of this muscular and metabolic stress and then still call upon it in the final couple miles to perform. And I think that's a real secret to somebody's like their ultra marathon performances, is how can we mitigate these fatigue markers and still call upon our body to access these higher gears. And I think those progression runs are fantastic for that.
I think so too. And I think not only physically, but mentally, right? When we're late in a run and you can actually hit the goals that you want, it's pretty powerful. You feel pretty strong, like, wow, I just ran 15 miles and I came back and I was able to run the next 5 miles at my tempo or threshold pace. And I'm feeling really good, right? Because I was able to do that. And I think sometimes, you see that workout on your training log and you're like, whoa, that seems really hard. I don't know if I can do that, but you get out there and you get going and you're able to achieve it. I think it really develops grit for those big endurance events, learning that you can do those hard things late in the run.
Absolutely. And we're talking about some of the like later periodized like
For
tempo
sure.
runs, right? So maybe before we really dive into like the sexy stuff that we've been talking about, the stuff that everybody
Yeah.
wants to put up on Strava, maybe we start ground zero. Like somebody's nice and new to tempo running, but they've been accumulating some base, they have some consistency in their plan. It doesn't matter how many miles a week they run, how often they run. Let's just say for the past 3 months, they've been consistent about getting outside, getting their legs turning. Where would you take that athlete and like how would you give them a tempo run to start, and then how would you build that out?
So I actually like to step back a little bit and start working on some stride work at more of a tempo pace, so that we're starting to, turn your legs over a little faster than maybe you're used to at that easy pace, and building that for a little bit, getting people a little more comfortable with moving a little faster, and then progressing from there, maybe a couple of 10-minute tempo runs with some, 2 to 3 or 4 minutes in between, and then building from there. What would you do?
Yeah, I think that's huge that you just mentioned the stride piece. I love introducing strides to people way before tempo blocks, just because, a stride, let's call it, the way that I define a stride is it's a total of 30 seconds. The first 10 seconds are going to be like a build from your easy pace to maybe like a 5 or a 10K pace. You're going to hold that for the middle 10 seconds. And then the tail end of the 10 seconds, you're going to ramp slowly back down to an easy pace. So I think that's a really good 30-second dose. Give somebody, 2 to 3 times a week. You do, a handful, maybe 4 to 8. I think that gives somebody a really good dose just to get their biomechanics and their joints kind of used to opening up that stride without having somebody extend that for too far. So I think that biomechanic work that you're incorporating into your coaching practice is huge to be able to set somebody's body up to be able to handle, like a similar speed, but a longer duration. What I usually do for tempos is after we've been working on some stride work like that, I usually tell my athletes, like we're looking for that 7 out of 10 intensity. We're going to give you, let's say we give you 2 10-minute sessions or 2 10-minute intervals. I'll do some of those. Maybe I'll do 4x6s, because that'll give us 24 minutes total of accumulation at tempo intensity. It really depends on the athlete and where I think they're at in their running career. If we want to go straight for the longer stuff and only a couple reps, or maybe some shorter intervals, but more of them. So it'll be something like that, maybe like 4x6 minutes, or 3x8 minutes, or 2x10 minutes, somewhere in there. It's kind of semantics at that point, but there's many ways to skin a cat, right?
Right.
So I'll start there, and then through the weeks, I'll keep up with my athletes and just see, how does this feel on your body? Does it feel comfortably fast? Do you feel like you still have a lot in the tank? Because only 20 minutes to 30 minutes accumulated at a tempo intensity. Remember, tempo being below your threshold. You shouldn't be getting that super metallic taste in your mouth. You shouldn't be getting a ton of burning in the legs. Your breathing should be fairly controlled. It's not going to be too stressful, because remember, if we have 20 to 30 minutes at a pace that realistically we could sustain all out in a race for an hour to an hour 15 minutes, it's not going to feel terribly hard, but it's going to keep reinforcing that, like, hey, let's just edge up to the upper end of our aerobic capacity. So over the coming weeks, I'll keep up with my athletes, see how they're feeling, make sure they're stoked up on their efforts, maybe compare their paces to previous races. Or if somebody doesn't have a previous race, I talk with them deeply about, what did your body feel? What was your mind doing? Did you have fun? Like all of this stuff, to try to get an idea of, what are you feeling? Because after studying this myself for so long and studying within myself, I have an idea of like, okay, what's my perception at that pace? And I can help an athlete find that feel. But again, we'll build up, and I really like to increase the number of repetitions. So like, say we start at like 2x10, maybe in 1 to 2 weeks, we go to 3x10s. And I like to keep my rest intervals just about half as long as the interval itself. So if we're doing 10 minutes, you're going to go out and you're going to jog for like 5 minutes in between. So once we build up to like between 40 to 50 minutes or so of tempo running, then we can start to cut down on that rest. And I think cutting down on that rest is another driver for change, for stimulus, because now you're having your body do the same amount of work, but in a condensed window. So if I can get somebody from running, 4x10s with 5-minute breaks in between, to doing 4x10s with 2.5-minute breaks in between, you're just teaching your body how to better and quickly repurpose that lactate, either for energy or to shuttle it and clear it away, so that you don't get a lot of that hydrogen burning that you feel. So that's what I like to do, is I like to get people in somewhere within that window, and then start to reduce the rest a little bit.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's important, like you said, I mean, we just kind of start at a shorter distances with longer rest in between. I mean, not for is so much physically, I think for some people, I think it's more mentally because I think that they're a little bit more mentally challenging than just going out and doing an easy run, right? Because we're like in that comfortably hard zone where we have to focus on maintaining the pace that we want, where we're used to running all of this easy, where you're just kind of going out and moving your legs. Now you have a little bit more focus. So I think it becomes more of a mental factor than a physical factor. So
Yep.
building people up and giving them the confidence to be able to do that, I think is big too. So I think that progression is nice to move into, and also changing it up is nice because it gives you a little bit of variety, but you're still hitting that same stimulus, right? Because you're still working on that tempo pace.
Absolutely. And I'm gonna put a little bit of a bookmark there for the listeners, because we're definitely going to talk about this when we start talking more about threshold running, which again is that higher intensity running, because I've been dabbling with a lot of different types of threshold runs. Some people call it flux training or over unders. So just let's put a pin in that engagement piece of that mental capacity to stay zoned into what you're doing. Until about like another 15 to 20 minutes down the road. But I love that
For
you
sure.
say that, because when I prescribe somebody like, 4 sets of 6 minutes with 3 minutes rest in between, you are, did I say 4 sets? I meant 4 intervals, 6 minutes with 3 minutes rest in between. Excuse me. But you have more time to kind of dial back your intensity, recollect yourself mentally, and then kind of get rezoned into, okay, what am I trying to feel? I think with a lot of runners, like we can start doing an intensity and think, I have to race this, or I could go faster. I could go faster for these 6 minutes. So it gives you more time to like break and think about, what Coach Reese was saying, and this should feel like, does this kind of feel like that or no? I think doing more intervals like that as well lets the body warm up to the pace a little bit better too. A lot of times when you prescribe somebody, 4 to 5 different intervals, maybe 6 different intervals around that time frame, the first 1 or 2 are really not going to feel hard. Remember, if you're only doing 6 minutes at a time, what you could do for an hour to an hour and 15 minutes, it's not going to feel terrible. So you kind of build in, you kind of let your body warm up, and then by the time you get to your later intervals, it's just a more, you have more time to re-engage with, is this what I should be feeling?
Yeah. And I like that. I think a term that people use for these kind of intervals are cruise intervals, right? I think cruise is a good way to describe it because you're just kind of on cruise, right? I think a big mistake people may make with doing tempo intervals or even threshold intervals is that they're trying to push the pace too hard, and then they're starting to get more towards VO2 max. And it's because, we're kind of ingrained to go, well, I can go faster than that. Let me show my coach that I can go faster. But that's not the point of that workout, right? So you're wanting to maintain the pace that you're supposed to do for each of those intervals. And even the following week, your goal isn't to try to beat the times you had the week before, right? We're still working on that goal so that we can raise the bar.
Exactly. Yep. And I think too, instead of increasing the pace, a lot of people could benefit more from decreasing the rest, especially with these types of intervals. So maybe you spend 3 to 4 weeks, and technically you're not running your tempos any faster, but if you're doing them with less recovery, like you're building more durability as a runner, able to hold and maintain that pace for a longer amount of time. Oftentimes, intensity is kind of one of the last things that I'll change for people, for sure. Especially once we dial in, how these intensities should be feeling for them.
Right. And what do you think people can look at to kind of decide, am I improving? Rather than trying to go faster, how can they look at what they're doing and like thinking about their body, how they know that they're getting stronger?
There's the hard metrics, and I think, like the easiest answer that a coach could tell somebody is like, oh, well, if you can keep if your heart rate goes down a little bit during these during these intervals on average, then you're getting fitter. But it doesn't always come down to that. I think that a good metric for, are you getting fitter, is how do you feel at the end of the run? Like during a tempo run, you shouldn't be gassed. I think intrinsically we all have this ability to qualify our runs based on like, how we feel afterwards. If somebody starts off with 4x6s and they're only accumulating about 24 minutes of tempo pace, and then in a couple weeks they're doing 2x15s, which is 30 minutes total. And if you can do that with less rest and feel better at the end of that one than, the one a few weeks beforehand, you're doing great. So I think too, just that ability to maintain engagement with your pacing, with what you're doing, with how far you are in these intervals. These intervals are great because you have to pay attention for such a long time. You can't really let your mind slip and wander too much. So I think that's also another like huge metric for improvement is, can I keep engaged with this? Can I keep into this pace for a longer amount of time and not have it wear on me anymore mentally?
Yes. Yes. I think that mental piece is huge to be watching, because it's going to get easier the more that you're used to it and the more you continue doing it, I think.
Okay. And so now let's get into threshold running. So we define tempo running as, beneath the threshold. Okay. So like, what are we actually trying to feel at this threshold pace? What do you tell your athletes they should be experiencing when they feel this threshold?
So I think that again, it's when there, I believe tempo running and threshold running are really close together. So it's a little bit hard to separate. I think it's a little more than comfortably hard. Probably in the scale, it's probably 7 to 8. We're probably running close to 90% heart rate, when we're getting into the threshold piece. What do you say? Or what do you think?
I always tell my athletes, if you have a good race result that's in that area, that's a great place to start, because now we kind of have this pace and we can tell people, okay, this pace is going to be what you experience, especially, after like 20 to 30 minutes, like that feeling that you're experiencing. And if people don't have that to go back on, I usually tell them this is where you're just starting to taste metal in your mouth. You're just starting to feel, like the legs are getting just a little bit heavy. You have to be engaged a little bit more than a tempo run. When you're in your tempo pace and you're only doing it for, like between 6 to 15 minutes at a time, to a certain degree, you're just kind of clicking over. You keep a little mental thought with it. You're just clicking over. It's all good. But these threshold paces demand just a little bit more mental acuity. So that's where I tell people, if tempo running is a 7 intensity, I want you to be at like a 7.5, like maybe like you're not touching 8, but you're almost there. So and this boundary, this area where our body is producing lactate faster than it can clear it. It's that Goldilocks zone of, we're starting to introduce all of these fatigue factors to the muscles, but we're trying to like improve our body's ability to deal with these fatigue factors. So we're not going to be able to run our thresholds quite as extensively as our tempos. And this is where I use more interval work. Whereas like my golden tempo run for, just about anybody, if you can do like, 2 to 3 by 15 minutes, and you can feel controlled and you can feel great, that's a great place to be with your tempo running. But with threshold running, we're going to be working more like between 4 to 6, maybe 4 to 8 different intervals, where you're going to be running about like 6 to 8 minutes. And that intensity piece at the end of that 8 minutes is like, I want you to be tasting some metal in your mouth. I don't want it to be so hard that you just want to quit and die. Something that you still have control over, but you're going to be tasting that like more than your tempo runs for sure.
Right. And I do like to collect a little bit of data to try to figure out where is that lactate threshold. So like you said, using a recent race is always a nice place to start. But if we don't have a recent race, I will have them do like an hour assessment, just kind of go out, do an easy run, then try to hold a steady pace that's comfortably hard, that they can maintain for about 30 minutes. And then we can kind of look at that data to kind of figure out, okay, what does that pace look like for you right now? And I do like to do checkbacks in, because that we can improve that, right? It doesn't stay like that forever. It can go up. And so, and I think in newer runners, we'll see that increase quicker, because people that haven't been doing that are going to adapt to that stimulus a little faster, I think. So we can go back, we can do rechecks and reevaluate where it's at. And also, I think you as an athlete can let your coach know, right? Communicating how these are feeling. If that pace is starting to become an easier pace for you, then it's probably time to reevaluate. And I also think that your threshold can decrease if we have a pause in running, for a little bit, and we need to build that back up. So it might be just the opposite. Like, okay, I think maybe that pace is a little bit hard for me now, because you can't just go off your PR that you had 2 years ago, because it's not going to be the same as it is today.
Yeah, I think those field tests are huge, and that's a great way that people. I usually don't give those to newer runners to do field tests, just because I really want to see a lot of consistency. Because when you go out and you do 30 minutes really hard, almost at like a race pace, like it definitely demands like more concentration, more motivation than going out and trying to proxy these paces. But yeah, I mean, like there's different field tests out there that people can look at where, you run really hard for 30 minutes, you plug it into a calculator, and then it'll give you a proxy for your threshold pace. There's different intervals that you can do where I know there's another test that has you do like a 3 minute all out, take a break, and then like a 9 minute all out, take a break, and then go out for like a 20 minute, like, hard run and see what your paces are. So people can do that. And even if people have like a marathon PR, or if they have a 5K PR, you can plug those into race calculators and kind of get a proxy for around what your threshold pace is. But I think too that like it's also important to say that threshold and tempo intensities, intensity just meaning how it feels on the body, and pacing is different. Because if we're running our threshold intensity, our body's going to be feeling the same thing. But let's say there's a day that you're really low on sleep and you didn't have a snack before your run and you're kind of hungry, like your threshold intensity is going to feel the same, but your pace may slow down, So your body might
Yep,
be
that's a
working
good point.
at its
Yeah.
threshold, but it's not the same pace. So that's where I think as a coach, I personally think RPE is like the gold standard for getting people to understand what that is. Now, if we can use, okay, what should my body feel, plus what does Macmillan running say my threshold pace is a proxy to, because of my marathon PR, we can kind of start to use those two things, and we can start going at a pace and say, okay, is this the intensity that Coach Loretta was telling me I should feel? So I think that's a
Right.
great way to find those for sure.
Yep. And I kind of like to guide athletes. I believe that really being in tune with your RPE, or rate of perceived exertion, is great, but some newer runners are not in tune with that. I mean, it takes a lot of practice to get in tune with that. And so also giving them some metrics like pace or heart rate, to kind of have some things to think about when they're trying to gauge the rate of perceived exertion. So they're kind of learning how all of those pieces kind of fall together. Of course, we know that they're variable, right? Like you said, intensity can be variable. Heart rate can be variable based on so many different factors that change our heart rate, right? So we can't rely on one, I don't think, single source. But by giving them some tools in their toolbox to kind of be able to use things as gauges, because I find that a lot of runners are like, well, just tell me a pace. They want to know, like, what should I be running at? So
Yeah.
I think the key is the coach can help guide you, but the key is providing feedback on how you're feeling, how's your body feeling when you're in those positions, so that the coach can also help to adjust that, as needed.
Yep, and I think that tools in the toolbox component is really important, because we want to be able to look at all of these metrics. One of an anecdote I always give to my athletes, I don't know if I brought it up on here, excuse me if I already have, but when I was running Hennepin 50 mile, I was looking down at my Chorus watch, and I was like, like, this is weird. It's giving me my heart rate. It's telling me that I'm at like 186, like, but I feel good, and I'm running the pace that like I wanted to try to hold during the race. So if I'm very myopically focused on like, okay, I told myself at the beginning of the race, I would only keep it at, 150 heart rate, or lower, like I would have been shooting myself in the foot as far as my performance went, because if I would have looked at my watch, saw that it said 186, and then thought, oh my gosh, I got to slow down way harder, like I wouldn't have been able to push as hard as I could have. And when I look back at that run overall, like my overall pay, or my overall heart rate was an average of like 175, which for me, I know if I was wearing like a chest strap and I was doing intervals, that would be like a threshold pace, or a
Right.
threshold heart rate intensity for me. So, um, you know, it's physiological, just like we talked about. It's impossible to hold your hour and 15-minute effort it took me about 6 hours to finish that race. So I know that my heart rate was lying to me. But if I was only myopically focused on my heart rate instead of my rate of perceived exertion, I would have been freaking out like, oh my gosh, I got to slow down and not
Right.
hit the time goal that I was looking to go for.
Right. I love that you said that. And maybe that should be a topic on another date, because I do think sometimes as we're learning new skills, so we're learning about rate of perceived exertion, we're learning about heart rate, we're learning about pace. And then you go into an event kind of having an idea of in your mind, and then a metric like that seems really off. Then we have to ask ourselves a systems check, right? And go, all right, is my heart rate, is it really that high? How do I feel? Can I talk? How's my breathing? You know, all of those pieces. So we're answering a lot of questions during that run and trying to analyze as we're on the move, right? And so we can't get caught up in just one thing, because it might not be as accurate as it seems, right? And so I think working with your coach on that, I think, is huge, because you know your coach is going to send you in with some of those things and those tools, but they're just not that black and white, I guess. You know, it's just not that simple.
Yep, exactly. And, you know, it's funny. We're talking about these, like the physiology toolbox that we have, you know, like with heart rate, with RPE, with all that stuff. But at the same time, too, if you're in the middle of a race and you look down and you're freaking out because your heart rate's so high, then we also need to simultaneously go into the mental skills toolbox and start
Yes,
pulling out some of those
yes.
those mental skills to say, okay, I'm not going to get stressed about this. I'm going to problem solve. If I get stressed, things are going to get worse. My judgment's going to be off. So what are the tools that I have to keep myself calm in that situation? So,
I love that, because then your heart rate's just going to increase because you're panicking, and
yeah,
just breathe.
yep, exactly. So to pull out that bookmark that we were talking about before, once I take athletes and we build them up through a couple different weeks of some threshold running, you know, I rarely ever introduce threshold runs into like a long run, because it's just a really hard stimulus on top of like already a lot of time accumulated on your on your legs. So what I really like to do with my threshold, once I build somebody up to being able to handle around like 20 to 30 minutes of threshold pacing, um, is I like to do this flux training. I like to do this training where we're working between these two intensities that we have.
I was going to
So
say that. Yep.
I actually did this type of run yesterday, where I'm running at my tempo pace, and it's more of a moderate tempo. It's probably like 15 to 20 seconds off of my true lactate, like my tempo pace, right? But then I spent about 3/4 of a mile there. And then for 1/4 of a mile, I was dipping into about 15 seconds above that lactate threshold. So what I'm doing right now is I'm getting my legs clicking over. I'm at this intensity where I'm just working just below where my body is accumulating lactate. But then I have this brief period where I introduce a higher intensity and I really introduce a lot of lactate to the system. And then when you scale back down to your tempo again and you don't go slower, you're teaching your body how to deal with a lot of lactate at a quicker pace. So what my workout looked like yesterday was 8 rounds, and I built up to that, 8 rounds of 3/4 mile at float, and then 1/4 mile at a hard effort. So you're just instantly flipping back and forth between this. Okay, I'm running comfortably hard, and then I'm running really hard, and then going back to comfortably hard.
Mm-hmm.
I did that completely on flat. Now, some people, this is a trail running podcast. What is flat running going to do for my trail racing? Well, if you can teach your body how to flip back and forth between I'm giving a really hard effort and now I'm floating back into a comfortably hard effort, that's just hill running right there, right? Like we have Earth Day coming up. We have other races coming up. Galena's coming up. I don't know how you say that. Galena.
Galena.
Apologies.
Yeah.
Okay. Apologies. Um, you know, when we're running these hills, maybe our pace isn't going any faster, but all of a sudden, we're flipping into that hard effort because we meet a tough hill. We got to get up that hill and then be able to settle back into our comfortably hard pace, you know, and be able to flip through those gears.
Right.
So, and that's, you know, that's after we build somebody up a couple weeks just doing, you know, doing tempo running and then doing threshold running on its own. Then we can start to blend the two.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yep, I agree. And I also think that we I lost my train of thought there for a second, but I think with the variability, we can throw that in, right, to mix things up a little bit. And then also I like to add in a little bit of stride work at the end.
Oh,
So
yeah. Yep, absolutely. And again, that just reinforces, okay, we had a tougher workout where we called upon our body's ability to, process glucose a little bit at a higher intensity. We called upon our body's ability to clear out all this lactate. We put a lot of stress on the joints and on the muscle tissue. Now we're going to have a little bit of a cool down period and then add some strides at the end. We're just reinforcing, hey, let's click into that higher gear after we've already given a solid effort and we've built up some of
right,
that fatigue.
right. And I
And
think that it's important. You mentioned trail running versus, flat running. I think it's important to have a bit of a blend, even if you prefer the trails. I do think some of that faster work on flatter is also going to provide you benefit, especially when we're doing that tempo type workout or a faster even VO2 max workout. I think having some time on flat is important too. Thoughts on that?
yeah, I don't like running the roads for personal enjoyment, but
Yep.
I love running the roads for being able to titrate my intensities, being able to dial in, eliminate variables. So one of the only things I'm worrying about is what is my body feeling and
Yeah.
what intensity am I going at. So I think when we're running trails, we have the scenery, we have the roots and the rocks that we have to dodge. We have the hills, the uphills, the downhills. Maybe we're listening to music or talking with a friend. There's a lot of things going on that we could be paying attention to instead of just being one with our bodies and what we should be feeling. So I think for sure, for the most diehard trail racers, I think there's a good time to do it, and I believe that time is actually right now. Trail conditions it's warmer here in Illinois
Yes.
where I'm at. Trail conditions are really sloppy and really muddy. You're not going to be able to go too fast on
Yeah.
the trails. But what we can do is, if you don't want to get super muddy, if you don't want to get super wet, maybe we can go out onto the roads and we can pay a little bit more attention to what is my body feeling right now. So that way, when we get to that prime time of the year, we can say, okay, like I already built this speed work. I already put the money down there. Now I can use that to aid my trail running once conditions are a little bit better. I think that's
Yeah.
huge.
I agree. All right. Well, I think that we ought to wrap it up. We've had a nice discussion today, and I appreciate meeting with you and just listening to your knowledge as well. I think it's a great opportunity for me as well as our community. So thanks, Reese.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to synthesize everything that we said so far, tempo running is going to be just below your threshold pace. So it's going to be a little bit easier running, but we're going to try to run a little bit longer at that pace. Threshold running is going to be at that point where we're just starting to accumulate that metallic taste and a little bit of burning sensation in the legs. So being able to build up each intensity on their own over weeks and then being able to synthesize those together and blend the two intensities together closer towards races is going to be a great way to periodize some of your races so that way, or to periodize your training so that way your races go a little bit more accordingly.
Right. And overall, it's going to build endurance and intensity for our endurance. And who doesn't want that when we're running these big, long races, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. It ensures a quality finish and helps ensure a good time.
Yeah. And I think tempo is important from, let's say, 5K to ultra marathon. I mean, I think all of those distances can benefit from tempo runs. I think I might have lost internet. So I am not sure if I'm still here with Reese, but he is frozen. So I'm going to say goodbye for both of us. And thanks for joining today. Bye.